There are moments when the mask slips and you finally see how the world really works. Today is one of those moments. Behind every crash, every liquidity wipeout, every unexpected move in Bitcoin, there is a plan built by institutions that see money as a weapon and markets as terrain. Simon Dixon has spent 2 decades studying the machinery behind global finance. He's fought it from the outside as a CEO and co-founder of Bank to the Future, one of the earliest investment platforms for Bitcoin, fintech, and blockchain startups with early stakes in Kraken, Bitstamp, Coinbase, Ripple, Circle, and many others. He published the first Bitcoin book back in 2011, long before the world understood what was coming. And today, he's exposing the invisible system connecting the dollar, currency wars, debt cycle, Wall Street, and Bitcoin, all part of a long game that you were never meant to see.
Everything in America is about extracting value through the dollar system over to the proof of weapons network.
This network manages capital the same way an empire manages territory. It absorbs, it restructures, it evolves, and when the current phase reaches its breaking point, it prepares for the next one.
The dollar is a Ponzi scheme. You have to keep rolling over, because there's not enough dollars to pay off all the debt. So this network basically is not designed to last. It's designed to fall like the British Empire and transfer power to the next structure.
The same institutions that broke the old system are constructing the new one, digital, programmable, and deeply connected to every corner of the financial system.
I've worked in the investment bank. And so I know when they want to financialize, securitize, and now tokenize, it's because they want to own, they want to control, and they want to extract.
Bitcoin emerged as a challenge to that architecture. It sits outside their playbook until they find a way to pull it back in. And according to Simon, that process is well underway.
They're constructing all the financial weapons of mass destruction to try and persuade you to give your Bitcoin to them.
This influence stretches far beyond markets. It shapes the companies we trust, the leaders that we admire, and the entrepreneurs who appear untouchable on the surface.
Through these levers of control, you're able to make what appear to be the richest, most independent, companies and entrepreneurs in the world, but they're all subordinate to these financial weapons of mass destruction.
Simon Dixon lays out the entire blueprint, how the elites plan to turn crypto into their next control grid, and what you can still do to escape it.
And these are simple things that everyone can do.
This is the real architecture of global power most people are afraid to even talk about, revealed by someone who's seen it from the inside. Stay locked in, because this conversation will change how you understand the world, money, control, and the real endgame for Bitcoin. Me personally, I've been obsessed with 2 questions since I was a kid. What's really out there in the universe? And who actually pulls the strings down here on Earth? Today, we're lucky, guys. You and I get closer to answering the second one. This episode is longer than usual, but if you care about where Bitcoin and your personal freedom are headed, you're going to want to watch every second. And before we hit stop on this interview, I invite Simon back because, as you'll see, I still have many more questions. And again, remember, nothing in this video is financial advice. It's for educational purposes only. Without further ado, let's welcome Simon Dixon to the stage. All right, Simon, welcome to the channel, man. It's really good to have you. I don't know if you know this or not, but you've really been a big an inspiration in my life. Mostly, well, not only did you one of the very first kind of few people to publish a book on Bitcoin, or the very first person, but also be so see the potential, dive in, do something about it, and start building your life and businesses around this idea. Bank to the Future is a platform that you started that most people who know me know that that's where I got my early start in investing in life. And, it was because I got Bitcoin early in 2012, but a lot more in 2013. And then it was interesting at that point. I had to, I had to make a decision. Do I want to, because I exited fiat, at that point, like I took all my money and put it in Bitcoin. And so I had to make decisions, when these deals came to the table through Bank to the Future of, do I want to trade my Bitcoin for, Coinbase, or do I want to trade my Bitcoin for Kraken? And it was, at that point, I think back then, maybe I still had some certainty that like, this is probably going to be something that's used by the world. And I think maybe I felt like, I would say by 2016 or so, I was probably like 40% sure that maybe it would be a global reserve currency one day, or a global reserve one day, and maybe even like a peer-to-peer electronic cash somehow. And then we had the block wars debates after that, which didn't make it feasible for this peer-to-peer cash. But I thought at least there's always going to be that, because I also believed it was quite anonymous at the time. I think a lot of us did. And so I thought like there's definitely going to be a use case for this. I just didn't know how big it would get. Every year subsequent to that, I got maybe 10% more confident. And like today, I 100% believe that it will be a world reserve. People like Larry Fink and others, won't say that necessarily, but they try to be a little bit more conservative in their public, what they say in public, because they don't want to be seen as like insane or something like that, because I think most people still think that idea is insane. But anyways, yeah. So I loved what you were able to do. The deal flow that you had on the platform was insane. Probably a higher hit rate than any other platform that, from a Kickstarter to an Indiegogo to a WeFund or whatever these platforms are, these crowdfunding platforms, or even like, LPing in a GP fund, like these deals were a higher hit rates, crazy. Like, how much came out of that. But I just want to say thank you, and it's been an inspiration for me, because I don't know if you and I talked at one point. I think we did, where you told me that you really wanted to be able to bring this to the retail. And that's what I've always wanted, right? I've always wanted to give to, but the first time I started thinking of myself as an investor, and fortunately because of the Bitcoin, I was considered an accredited investor. So I was privileged enough to come onto the platform and make these deals. But I always thought it'd be so great to be able to bring retail on board. And I think you told me that you had spent years and millions of dollars trying to make that happen. And it just seemed impossible at the time. Can you just tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, it's great to hear from from our customers. We were creating in 2014. We were creating Bitcoin bonds. In 2015, we were creating Bitcoin VC funds. In 2012-13, when companies in our sector couldn't get venture capital funding, we were, allowing people to pull together through our structure and get people investments. And, we did Coinbase, Kraken, Bitfinex, Circle,
Ripple,
even things like Ripple Labs. And, that's now just been valued at 40 billion. Coinbase IPO'd at 100 billion. Bitfinex created Tether, which is now changing the structure of the dollar around the world. Got like backed by $185 billion worth of treasuries or whatever it may be. So it's been quite the journey.
Yeah, and Coinbase did Circle too, right? So we have both stable coins covered there.
Yeah, correct. And now we got the Kraken IPO coming up. We got, I think, Securitize now.
Yes.
And
I did all of those.
Yeah. And Robinhood as well. Like it's
I missed that.
It's been one heck of a journey. But yeah, it's been a real privilege. But yeah, the original mission was that I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference. A guy was pitching at the conference. I was actually deep in debt at the time
Really?
when that year, because I'd left my career in investment banking in 2006 to give lectures on monetary reform. And I left investment banking to create a non-fractional reserve bank. And when we applied for the license, the regulators said, firstly, they looked at my co-founder, which was my wife, and said, "You're not the type of person we'd regulate normally." The second thing they said is you need to put $60 million as a deposit to proceed with the application in the Bank of England. And then they said, you're not allowed a non-fractional reserve bank. You can do that, but you have to build it on top of Barclays, and Barclays will lever up or pick a clearing bank in the UK. So it was impossible to create what we wanted to create, which was money you can own, money you can spend, and money had a fixed supply. So when I went to the Bitcoin conference, understood how Bitcoin worked, I was ready for that message because I was, at the end of the tether of trying to create a non-fractional reserve bank. So a gentleman called Tony Galippi was pitching a company called BitPay. It was sponsored by an exchange called Mt. Gox. Mm-hmm. There was a guy, a journalist called Max Geyser and Stacey Herbert there. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin crashed from $30 to $3. There was a hackathon afterwards with a bunch of anonymous developers. I bought 5 Bitcoin for approximately $25 at the conference. And then I bought a Mars bar with a whole Bitcoin through a Bitcoin vending machine. And so we decided, let's, these companies can't get funding. We had a platform, so, we couldn't get a banking license, but we could get a securities license. And so we went on this long journey where we got the license that we needed. And then as regulators started discovering what Bitcoin was, we went on a 15-year journey of applying for license after license after license.
Wow.
And in the end, no matter how much we tried to democratize investing, it was impossible on a global scale. So we ended up, fortunately, the people that made all those early investments on our platform, we were paying out thousands of Bitcoin in dividends. They got wealthy and they became rich investors. And so we had this community of really wealthy investors. Yeah. I mean, we're talking people who are billionaires now. And we just built on that community, and we ended up with assets on many of the major companies that built this industry, and just have been getting more and more people into Bitcoin. Yeah. And then just hit the stage where we are right now, where we're just sat on a bunch of assets, and we're just trying to simplify people's lives now and just make sure they can get Bitcoin in self-custody. And just watch this whole journey where it's been through what you've said. When we were at $3, when we crashed from $30 to $3, we were just on a mission to disrupt banking. It was us versus the banks. No one really cared about the price. We were even surprised there was a price, right, when Mt. Gox came along. But over the years now, you're quite right. Risk adjusted, there is the likelihood of Bitcoin succeeding, is 100% certain. It wasn't 100% certain there. Well, it's never 100%, but you know what I mean? Yeah. And so people have the level of conviction that you have, and kind of we're at that Wall Street phase now where there's an ideological, shift at the moment where I'm trying to actively warn people about how Wall Street wants to use Bitcoin, and how you should use Bitcoin, how it was originally intended. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. And so I just give content now. Bitcoin's treated me better than I could ever imagine. The company didn't need any Silicon Valley funding, didn't need to go public. And we remained completely independent because we just did the Bitcoin treasury strategy, from 2011, 14 years on now, personally in the company, and then worked with various other countries along the process to try and get them to do it as well.
That's awesome. I mean, Yeah, I bought some. I'm not. Yeah, I also bought into Bank to the Future, the SPV. I think that was. I know that there's two. I don't remember which one I was in, but I hopefully the one with all encompassing. But 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 anyway, so now with the upcoming kind of the 180 turn in um, how America and then that policy influencing other countries, but Trump coming in and being make America the crypto capital of the world. Let's undo all the disaster that Biden did, and then Paul Atkins coming out and saying that actually it's most likely that most of these tokens aren't securities. And they want to create, and I've heard so just trying to read between the lines, I've also heard someone like Paul Atkins or someone else saying, we're going to work on ways to figure out how we can do essentially ICOs and token fundraising and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if you followed along closely there, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on like, where do you see just the kind of regulatory environment headed in the US and globally? And then also, do you think that there's potentially a chance where the thing that you and I both would hope to come true is more enabled? Like, will retail have access to these kind of awesome opportunities that they never have had before?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more negative on the outlook, but really because of the fundamental roots of where we started and what people are falling for.
Yeah.
So the way that I see the world right now is you have Bitcoin in self-custody, which is money you can own, money you can spend, and then money that has a fixed supply. But most people that are getting into Bitcoin right now are in for the fixed supply because they believe that this digital scarce asset is number go up technology, which it is.
Yeah.
I do believe that the demand for Bitcoin increases over time. And it has for 14 years, and I expect it to continue to do that for another 14 years. And so in that sense, I'm very bullish. But I also know what Wall Street does and what they're about because I used to be, a London, I've worked in the investment bank. And so I know when they want to financialize, securitize, and now tokenize, it's because they want to own, they want to control, and they want to extract. And so I'm very wary of it. So while you get this pro-crypto environment within the US, and I'm glad for it, but I want people to understand what it really means. What it really means is that the dollar is going to be repackaged into programmable money. And programmable money will be integrated into social credit scores, artificial intelligence, and surveillance technology.
Yeah, carbon credits that you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in Europe, it will be worse. It will be a central bank digital currency.
Do you think there's much of a difference between the Genius Act stablecoins and a CBDC, like the new regulation around stablecoins in the US and CBDCs? Do you think there's much of a difference there?
Yeah, the difference is it kind of goes into my central thesis that if you look at America, most people think of America as a democracy and they play in the political game. The thing that America is it through this financialization, securitization, and now tokenization process, America put everything up for sale. So every single resource within America is open to the highest bidder because you've got the stock market, you've got the government debt, the bond market, you've even got the banks, they're all public companies. You've got all the pooled investments via ETFs, which are managed by the large asset managers. The large asset managers are public companies. So you've got the debt market, the capital market, the credit market, the dollar creation market. And then you've got the politicians. And so the politicians work off a pay-to-play system. Mm-hmm. They are owned by lobbies. And they make you think that your vote matters, but actually your vote is manipulated by media control, and media control is controlled by large lobby groups, whether it be military, financial, pharmaceutical, consumption, technical. There's major lobby groups. So through this mechanism, the US is essentially what I call a host country for what I used a Bitcoin term like proof of work, proof of weapons, which kind of captures how it uses everything as a weapon.
Right.
And so when I think of America, I don't think of a sovereign country. I think of a political process, a Senate, a Congress, and even judicial, as well as every single asset is controlled by banks and financial institutions, whether it be BlackRock, it's a financial industrial complex, whether it be private equity, whether it be public equity, whether it be asset managers. It is controlled by a private structure. And that structure, the government is subordinate to that structure. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of America as the most liquid capital market, the host of the proof of weapons network, everything in America is about extracting value through the dollar system over to the proof of weapons network, which is why all of the value is extracted. The economy is just a tool for extracting value up to those that are part of the network.
Right.
And so you have this K-shaped economy where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and financial weapons and mass destruction are used in order to capture people into this network. Now, subordinate to that, so you have the proof of weapons network, then you have the U.S. government.
Just quickly before you go into that, just remember where you left off. I'm just trying to understand that when you say proof of weapons, is that the same thing when people say, oh yeah, the dollar's backed by the military industrial complex? Is that the same kind of analogy or is it different?
Sort of, but military industrial complex was kind of a post-Bretton Woods World War II order, where a manufacturing base in a physical company where you could enforce the dollar and debt onto people using military might.
Right.
Today, that was kind of the British Empire tool.
Yeah.
After World War II, these tools were passed on to the American Empire because, the Bank of England effectively bankrupted the UK government through its colonial expeditions. And it set up the Federal Reserve during just before World War One. And then World War One and World War II were used just as the Bank of England used the British government. The Federal Reserve used the American government in order to fully capture it to the point where it's now $38 trillion of debt. But the weapons are not just military. Military is in fact subordinate to the neo-economic financial weapons of mass destruction. And so all of these companies are public. That's how you control the military. And then if you want to use and gain access to Pentagon budgets, the government has to borrow the money. And who lends them the money? Well, the banks lend them the money and they get to create dollars every time they issue a loan. And so through the bond market and the credit market and the stock market, the financial industrial complex gets to decide whether the stock market of some of the military companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon get to receive the money, or whether you want to reset, for example, you can shift capital through lobby over to a company like Palantir, which is now cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, which kind of sits in a technical industrial complex. So you've got a military industrial complex, a technical industrial complex, a financial industrial complex, and then you get to redistribute how people spend that money when the banks create loans every time they create the dollar, and you can reallocate spending patterns through companies like Amazon and having like auto markets and mortgage markets where you never buy your house or you never buy your car. You financialize and securitize even student loans, and then you can change consumption habits based upon redirecting these mortgage-backed securities or auto loan-backed securities, and then you can insure them through credit default swaps. All this to say is you have these consumption complexes, technical complexes, military complexes, but who controls the game? It's the financial industrial complex. So the proof of weapons network is about weaponizing finance, technology, military, and debt-based consumption in order to, accumulate and consolidate as many assets in the hands of the financial industrial complex.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And through this mechanism, they've conquered Europe, they've conquered the UK. They took over many of the colonies. Some of them have been through decolonization. But essentially, we were talking about why does America have a stable coin under the Genius Act?
Yeah.
It's because corporate interest controls America. The government is subordinate to corporate interest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a country like Europe, the European Union weaponized the European Central Bank and a single currency in order to consolidate power around big Germany, which was essentially a big military base before World War II. And then it was weaponized after World War II into the dollar system. And you had these different nodes within the network, like Japan, which is, the carry trade. You can borrow at 0% from the Bank of Japan, and you can siphon all that investment back to America, lend it to the US government, and then they can use their weapons to force everyone else into dollar dependency. And the petrodollar was one of them, pricing oil in dollars, and the euro dollar was another one. And by putting it into a single currency, the European Union is just a tool for the network. And so when you look at things like Trump negotiating trade deals and increased NATO budgets, that's just a mechanism for getting the European Central Bank to print euros, and rather than euros being used for the people, they go back into purchasing weapons in the dollar proof of weapons network. That pumps up the stock market. It allows those companies to borrow against it, lever up the governments further, and the governments just become more and more subordinate through leverage, and they just become a printing press for the network. And so, all they do is push out narratives to justify war. And then through the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex, you end up with police states, surveillance states. And, like if you look at Keir Starmer, Merz, Macron, Carney, these are all essentially lobby controlled politicians where they just pretend that they work for the British people, the European people, the Canadian people, the German people, the French people. But their job is just to take those budgets and allocate them back up to the network to prop up the US stock market, to push the K-shaped economy where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then they get to borrow at 0% because they've got quantitative easing and various other tools. So it's a very sophisticated system.
Yeah.
That now the proof of network, it controls the US government, all the European governments, and then others, what we call the West, these liberal democracies. Democracies are install a central bank. That central bank becomes shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements becomes subordinate to the most important central bank, which is the Federal Reserve. And then monetary policy through organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, their job is to get people addicted to dollars and make sure that through their central bank, they print their own currency to pay off the dollar debt. And then they keep buying treasuries, they keep lending it to the US government. And the dollar is a Ponzi scheme. You have to keep rolling over, because there's not enough dollars to pay off all the debt. So this network basically is not designed to last. It's designed to fall like the British Empire and transfer power to the next structure, which is what I think we're witnessing right now. So taking it back to Genius Act, Genius Act is a mechanism for weaponizing stable coins and the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, digitizing the dollar beyond credit creation at the banks, integrating it with a social credit score through all this vast data like X and various other platforms, and all the government data from Doge. And Palantir has been contracted with all of the different governments to collect all the artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And then weaponize currencies And so the European Union doesn't get to have a stable coin because the network wants to extract value to the corporations that issue the stable coins. And a central bank digital currency means that you hand over all the power to the European Central Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And the European Central Bank is controlled by the European Union. The European Union was a product of the Bank for International Settlements. The controller of the Bank for International Settlements is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banks, and the banks push out the lobby money that installs all the politicians across America, and then also controls the military companies and the quote unquote deep state, which is the intelligence networks that can push out these covert wars and then use the media in order to push narratives that justify the wars and make you think that you're living in a democracy. And so the West is basically consolidated. And if you want to simplify it, at the very top of this chain is BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the creators of the dollar, which is the Chase Bank, and the European various other banks as well.
So it's just a little bit of so when I ask the question, like, are the most recent version of Genius Act and what they expect stable coins to comply with, like the outcome or the end goal is relatively the same as far as wanting to achieve like a surveillance state and the social credit scoring system. So because whenever I've talked about the dangers of CBDCs before, like that was the outcome if these things come to existence. It was your social credits. It was like China, and then it was the carbon credits thing, and then it was your money being on a chain that the government can control and take your taxes out of and turn it off if you've done something bad. So those things probably are going to still be the same with stable coins, right? It's just the fact that the differentiator here is that with stable coins, the U.S. Financial and industrial complex, essentially, who controls everything else, they're the ones benefiting from private business issued stable coins because that money stays back in America. Is that close to it?
Yeah, so America, like if you look at the US Constitution, it was designed to protect people from the tyranny of government as a foundation principle, but it didn't protect people from corporate interest.
Right.
And so now the government is subordinate to the corporate interest. And so the corporate interest doesn't want the government to be powerful. The government is just a tool for debt. And so, the military wants Pentagon budgets, take on more debt. And so you get the government $38 trillion in debt, which is increasing. But the ultimate power structure in America is the large multinational corporations. And so they want corporate power to reign. And the Constitution doesn't protect you from that. And so that's why you get a stable coin in America. Mm-hmm. Whereas because all the governments are subordinate to the same network, you can allow some of the power to consolidate into the central bank and the private banks across Europe and other countries, and then you can vassalize them all into one control grid.
Yeah.
And that's the point. And then if you look at Genius Act, there were several things in there. Firstly, it said if you want to be a stablecoin issuer that pays yield, i.e. a competitive stablecoin, then you have to have a banking license, i.e. you have to join the network. Also, there was, if you are a bank and you have reserves at the Federal Reserve, which is the proof of weapons network, they're primary dealers, they get to create dollars and they have reserve counts at the Federal Reserve, you can issue a stable coin using those reserves, mm-hmm. and you can pay yield. So now you've got, in the Genius Act, $3.5 trillion of liquidity for a stable coin for the banks that can pay a yield. And JP Morgan is the primary lobby, and the JP Morgan is a shareholder in the Federal Reserve. And so you've created a game for JP Morgan. And then you can have all these technical companies like World Liberty Financial, the Trump family, Elon Musk, I'm sure he'll have one via X. But they can have an uncompetitive stablecoin but it has to come back into the network. And so they just become tools for perpetuating control. And then you have all these technical, companies around it that provide the components. Palantir for artificial intelligence, data centers, ChatGPT, all these different people. But remember, people think that these are powerful, and they are powerful corporations. But their net. So if you take someone like Elon Musk, part of the PayPal mafia, with Peter Thiel, part of Palantir, they all of their technology and innovation came from the defense budgets. So all of the technology that we use today originally started as technology for killing people, and it was created by Pentagon budgets.
Right.
And then when they want to take those technologies mainstream, the government just hands them over to companies like Tesla, Apple, Google, Palantir, fund them by CIA deep state budgets. And then suddenly you get these massive technology companies using what the government created through Pentagon budgets and Department of Defense, but their net worth is dependent upon their public offering, their share options. And what does someone like Elon Musk do? Well, he says, I want to buy X from Jack Dorsey or, a public company. So what did he do? He goes to the proof of weapons network, JP Morgan or a various bank, and says, I've got Tesla stock. I want to use it as collateral when you issue me a loan. And then I'll go to the Gulf countries like the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund and various other co-investors. And then I'll get the $55 billion needed to buy X. But now, as soon as you borrow from the proof of weapons network and use your stock as collateral, and your returns and your net worth is pegged to your share options, you're a bitch for the network. And so Elon has I'm a 400. You may have $400 billion of net worth, but you're not independent. If they want to engineer a stock market crash to make the share options worthless, a media frenzy in order to, make it where his net worth can now be margin called against his debt. Then they can use these financial weapons of mass destruction to say, you need to play ball. And so X now needs to be a social credit score, and it needs to feed back into the deep state and the NSA. And then that needs to come back into integration with stablecoins. So, through these levers of control, you're able to make what appear to be the richest, most independent, companies and entrepreneurs in the world, but they're all subordinate to these financial weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. With Elon, it's interesting because I watch a lot of his interviews. And when he goes into something that is pretty unstructured and just like free form discussion, like it was, if he goes on Joe Rogan or something, several times that you've seen like a lot of the part of the conversation where he's just very comfortable, like in his tone, the kind of the way he's sitting, he's relaxed, he's just having discussion, he's laughing. But then some questions he get asked and the responses are very weird, right? Like you can tell that he's like not really allowed to talk about some of these things. And he doesn't just say like, no, I don't think that exists or like whatever. He gets this totally different state of, you can really tell that he's trying super hard to make a case that he like disagrees or doesn't believe in that thing, or it's like over expressing something when you want people to, you're trying to hide something, but I noticed that. But
yeah, I mean, Elon is a tool for the military industrial complex and the technical industrial complex, which is subordinate to the financial industrial complex. So it's a bit of a red pill once you understand how the world works. And this is how I've always tried to help people understand that, there's an interesting phrase, money makes the world go round. That is 100% correct when it comes to neoliberal, markets where you have a bank that is creates dollars, a Western central bank, and then you open up everything to the highest bidder. And that kind of creates friction, right? Because at the moment, you maybe as an American want an America first agenda, but the government is subordinate to the network, and the network is actually a global institution. And so if China wants to own America, they just need to get shares in BlackRock. If a Gulf country like Saudi Arabia wants to own America, they just need to get a position in BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And then the shareholders get to install a board member, and the executives work for the board works for the shareholders. And so you can buy influence in the network as wealth changes. And so that's where it becomes really interesting right now, because foreign control is able to subdivert and become an important node on the proof of weapons network, which means that then there is no nationalist agenda. And you end up in a situation right now where people believe that Trump works for America. But when I follow the money, I say, no, Trump doesn't work for America. Trump is a tool of the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex. And what does the money managers want right now? Well, they want to reset the world order into multipolar blocks.
100%.
And so what's the best way of doing that? Tariffs. Tariffs was the ultimate strategy to reset the world order.
Tariffs, ripping back red tape from which I personally think it's a good thing, but nonetheless it's for the same purpose. So ripping off the red tape from things like nuclear, AI safety, supersonic passenger travel, supersonic travel, all these things that he's done since that has happened have opened up a lot of money coming in to support these industries. A lot of money coming into the being spent and now created. But I want to ask you something because I thought about this a lot, right? And when I was younger, I used to think about who really controls the world, and it's probably like the same type of thing that a lot of people who are getting into like tinfoil hat kind of things about the globalists or the elites. At first I thought probably maybe like 13 or 20 or 40 people or maybe 300 or whatever, that all had the roots from the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and all these guys. But then I guess a bit more recently, I felt like maybe it's the CIA mostly that are doing things, because from what I understand, there seems to be like zero oversight in the CIA. They seem to amass a ton of power when they were first created. They had like unlimited budgets. They were allowed to total secrecy. No one, not even the president, could understand a lot of stuff that they were doing. And it seems like whenever anyone tried to interfere, they were, assassinated. They started off with trying to do a lot of secret operations, and they still do. I think they're responsible for a lot of the stuff that has happened, and a lot of the other countries controlling narratives and all these kind of things. And I don't know if they're doing it, necessarily on instructions from, the president or the administration. There's just a lot that I think there's a lot that happens that the president himself doesn't even know about, right? So what do you think? What would your definition be of like the deep state, and the question of who controls the world a bit more complex than just like it's this entity or it's like these 10 people or whatever?
Yeah. So when the world, had privatized banks, you had wealth by families, when you can look back at the history, you had, these very wealthy. So if you look back, and this is where like kind of some of the conspiracy theories come from. So obviously, the Rothschild family, they had banks. They levered their interests in order to control governments and create privatized banks. And then they pushed out the central banking model. Like that was one era. But what I've seen is that people get stuck in an old paradigm without the fluidity of how the world actually changes. Mm-hmm. So power dynamics change. For example, it used to be ground. It used to be physical land. But now you can have a country that doesn't have that much land, but access to, like Singapore, for example, incredibly powerful because it has access to, these financial products and various other, influence in these choke points. And so you can have you can have strength in something and be very important to the network. But then as technology changes and as financialization changes, power can change significantly. So if you look at the old, banking dynasty families, you had the Warburg family, for example. The Warburg family was a governor in the Reichsbank, which is the bank that funded Nazi Germany and fascism. But also his brother was on the governor on the Federal Reserve. And so you had, they also, Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution during World War One, which took the Communist Manifesto, overthrew the Russian Tsar, and installed the Soviet Union. So similar families installed a central bank in America, were funded Nazi Germany, and were also funding communism.
Wow.
And so these families would hedge and profit from every side of a war. So after World War II, we immediately entered into a Cold War.
Crazy.
And that was the Soviet Union, communism, and fake capitalism, which is a Federal Reserve that creates a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to consolidate power over to the banks and where we are today. And so you can go down these conspiratorial routes, but what you end up in when you follow the dynamic of how it works today is many of these families structured their wealth into trust companies, offshore trust companies, and those offshore trust companies became exited and became shareholders and would hedge some of their wealth with gold and various other things, neutral assets. But they ended up public companies because going public is the exit strategy.
Right.
And so then once you've got all these banks that are going public, you then had the invention of engineered things like the global financial crisis. When you look at what happened during the global financial crisis, well, the Federal Reserve needed access to data and technology in order to decide which banks to go bust and which ones to bail out. Who was providing that technology? Well, it was BlackRock. And what did BlackRock determine they should do? Well, they should let these banks go bust. They should issue loans to these banks. These ones are the shareholders in the Fed as well, just so happens. And then we should divest Barclays iShares, which is the ETF department that BlackRock controls today. And so by having these ETFs, you essentially got everyone's pension, everyone's endowment money through colleges and universities, everyone's auto loans, everyone's mortgages, everyone's insurance premiums to passively invest and hand over their voting to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. And then they became shareholders in each other. Mm-hmm. And so BlackRock bought shares in Vanguard, Vanguard bought shares in State Street, Vanguard's still a private company. Yeah. And so you end up with this massive web of, in the end, what I would call a decentralized but unaccountable power structure, which actually does rule the world. But you can make mistakes. It's like nodes, right? Like Bitcoin. You could be running a node for this network, but this network, it doesn't have, it's not governed by maths and code, an algorithm. It's governed by a ruthless game where people can throw each other off the network all the time and power dynamics shift in this network. And so, if you look at BlackRock, they own board seats and shares in over 20,000 companies. And they passively get 12.5 trillion of assets to manage. Across State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, and others, there's about 25 to $30 trillion of assets. Mm-hmm. Whoever owns those shares rules the world. Now, who owns the vast majority and the voting shares? Well, then you've got a power dynamic that changes. And so when you look at, I answered this question because there's often a conspiracy, right? Let's be frank. People say Jews rule the world as a conspiracy theory, an anti-Semitic trope, whatever you want to call it. But it was because there was originally Christian power needed Jewish power in order to create banks, because it was forbidden to lend at interest by Christian theology. Whereas Jewish theology said, we can't lend to each other, but we can lend to non-Jews. And so the Christian rulers, and I don't mean religiously, I
Right.
mean, rulers that were aligned with Christianity used essentially Jewish families to create banks, and then that turned into a powerful industry. So over time it becomes more decentralized. But then if you look at, I did a study on this. If you look at wealth today, so this is where I think it's more decentralized and it's fluid, but it's not accountable. It's not accountable to the power structure. People think it's the politicians. Politicians are prostitutes. You pay them to do what you want them to do, and their job is to put a narrative to make you think you're doing it for the people, and that's their job. But at the top of the power structure, for example, I looked at this because people do these conspiracies. The last time someone looked at wealth, and you could question the data, it's on Wikipedia and various other things. Data's not perfect, but it said wealth is 55% aligned with those that identify as Christians, 36% aligned with those that identify as atheists, 8% aligned with those that identify as Muslims, 6% aligned with those that identify as Hindus, and 1% aligned with those that identify as Jews. And so you could say that is a gauge for, these different types of conspiracy theories, because you could say that what changes about those power dynamics. Well, we had the rise of China. So that was a decrease in Christian aligned wealth to atheist aligned wealth. Right. You had the rise of India. So that was an increase of Hindu aligned wealth. Then you had the petrodollar, which built vast sovereign wealth fund, which is Muslim aligned wealth. And so now you end up with rising powers and falling powers, and then they're able to buy the West. And so because the West is for sale, you've got the Gulf countries which are buying the West right now. Trump brags about how much inbound investment is happening in America. What does that mean? Inbound investment. Think of what the IMF model was. The IMF model was to enforce the world into debt slavery and dollar dependency.
Yeah.
How do you do it? By turning countries into distress, devaluing their currencies, and then using predatory loans in order to bail them out. And then they become subordinate to your power structure. So when Trump is bragging about $17 trillion of inbound investment, he's basically saying these are the power structures that are now going to control America. Because foreign direct investment means that you own more of the ownership structure of the country because the country is subordinate to the corporate interest.
Right.
And so, the answer is people want to think of it like a conspiracy. The answer is everything's a lie. Power changes fluidly. Yeah. But if you really want to put who's at the top of the structure, it's still access to capital flows and finance. And so JP Morgan, BlackRock, institutions that also have access to who's the deep state.
Right.
Well, the deep state, where was it created? You've got to go back. It was created from MI6, the British Empire, pre-World War I. They used covert wars in order to do their colonial expeditions and mercantilism to conquer gold and silver. They would get China addicted through opium wars, install a bank like HSBC, conquer Hong Kong, and then steal all the silver from China. Or they would take the tea trade. They would do a genocide of 50 million Indian people. Then they would access their tea resources, their culture, and then they would convert it to gold. And eventually power dynamics changed. As the British Empire fell, it got too complicated. But the power dynamics of the deep state, MI6, that remained. And so if you look at what happened after World War II, who was the power in America? Well, most of the gold from the world ended up in Fort Knox. So you had the Federal Reserve, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve were the banks. They ended up with a vast chunk of Germans' gold, many of the British gold, much of the British gold, much of the gold that left with the creation of the Soviet Union, with the overthrow of the Tsar. all ended up in Fort Knox Federal Reserve. They created an IMF structure, which is everyone stop converting your currency to gold, convert it to dollars, and we'll convert it to gold if you don't trust dollars.
Right.
And so that became like the default structure. And after World War, who else was powerful? Well, there were factions of power. There was what happened to the Nazis through Operation Paperclip. They merged into the CIA. They also had the Jewish mafia. Again, I'm not. People think that I'm saying Jews are the mafia. I'm saying just like there was an Italian mafia,
Right.
there was a mafia that was associated with the Jewish identity. There was a few people that had power in that structure. There was also the Italian mafia. So if you look at the formation of the CIA, it came from the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, partnership between the factions of Nazi Germany, the Jewish mob, the Italian mob. And what were they doing? It was a partnership with the military-industrial complex. And so the military would get Pentagon budgets. And then what did the CIA do? Well, it needed to do black op operations off book. You can't get congressional approval. So it created different industries: drug trafficking, sex trafficking, human trafficking, and weapons trafficking. And so the CIA would support all these networks of criminal activities, build black op slush funds, launder all the money through they created, the Jewish mob created the Vatican Bank. So the partnership between the Italian mafia and the Jewish financiers, that created a Vatican bank structure, which was actually laundered through the Vatican. And so all of this was declassified in documents. There's been investigations into the Pope's role and various other things. So these are all declassified. You could read a book like Operation Gladio to understand how this happened. But anyway, the deep state is a criminal network that is sponsored for corporate interests, and the contractors that work for the government for national security are the same contractors that work for the military industrial complex and financial industrial complex. And so if you're BlackRock and you're managing a vast portfolio, you can just create a portfolio management theory through hedging, through your banks and hedge funds. You can use the deep state via the military industrial complex to operate covert wars. You can get access to Pentagon budgets, and then you can hedge both bets of outcomes of the war and consolidate more power. So I put it to you that when you've studied books like read Covert Regime Change, it was a book of the 100 covert wars executed via this structure, to topple governments, destabilize colored revolutions, install political interference. Every war is unnatural. All the wars are unnatural.
What are the names of each of these books that you're recommending?
So if you want to understand about declassified CIA documents on wars, like Covert Regime Change, if you want to read about
it's called Covert Regime Change. Okay.
You could read Operation Gladio. That explains how terrorism works today. So these stay-at-home armies, what's happening in Nigeria, they fund these militia groups, use them in order to destabilize countries so that they can extract their resources and blame it on religion. And then they use religion in order to create these destabilization campaigns. So at the moment, I believe there's a destabilization campaign in the West, which is inciting Jewish hatred, Muslim hatred, using open borders, closed borders, in order to create religious and racial tensions. So that you can install the next layer of regulations like the Patriot Act. So that you can usher in your artificial intelligence and surveillance state. So, Operation Gladio is a good book by Paul Williams to understand these structures. I recommend, to understand the IMF, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, to understand the Federal Reserve. I recommend, like, The Creature from Jekyll Island is a classic. If you want to understand the history of central banking, the history of central banking and the enslavement of mankind. If you want to understand blackmail operations, Whitney Webb's done some good work, One Nation Under Blackmail. all I'd say is it's a journey. And I've been reading for 25 years and kind of putting it together. And so this proof of weapons network structure is kind of, once you understand how these flows work, it's so obvious. It's so like you can read any war, any media, and you can follow the monetary flows. And I do this every week on my YouTube channel to help people understand how everything you're being told is a lie.
That's amazing.
Because it's this corporate structure that really manages. And again, I'm not saying that they're the ultimate power structure. There are resistance. There are sovereign countries like China, Russia, the Gulf countries, various others.
Yeah.
But the West is collectively through neoliberal, quote unquote capitalism, which has got nothing to do with capitalism. It is essentially subordinate to this decentralized control structure that can install a president, install a prime minister, manipulate any type of election. And so, you can see the CIA manipulates every election around the world. And then you wonder if they do it to themselves. Of course they do it to themselves. And so you don't need to fall for this left, right, Republican, Democrat, Labor, conservative. None of that matters.
No.
You have no say. It's just a game to distract you from what really moves the world, which is money and capital flows.
So let's get into that, because this has been one of the most fascinating history lessons that I've ever had. I'm sure my audience will really appreciate that. But I think right now also a lot of stuff is happening. On the geopolitical level, we see the dollar as a global reserve decreasing quite a bit. And I think it's at like 55, 56% versus some time ago was it like 89% or something. So now they're trying to use stable coins to at least keep that number a bit more stable. But I think based on a couple of things that you said, Larry Fink, Vanguard, State Street, really having a lot of power over the world. What you see so far from BlackRock, I think it's funny when people say, "Oh, BlackRock just bought 1,000 Bitcoin." Like, no, they didn't. Like, they're just buying it for customers and earning fees off of it. So, I guess we can't really say that the United States as a country or BlackRock. Vanguard's now offering the ETFs through BlackRock to the customers who want it, but they're not buying either. And so we see a lot of corporations, trying to play the sailor game and the money go up charts and stuff like that. I'm still pretty sure that. No, I'm still actually am sure that eventually, like it should become a world reserve, because I don't know anything else better qualified to do that. I mean, even in 20, 30 years, gold will be less scarce than we believe it to be, right? We'll probably find massive deposits, or, a lot of people will be able to mine asteroids at that time, and you can't find, cryptographically finite Bitcoin on any asteroids, for example, and it's just easier to transfer, easier to keep collective. Like, we don't even know if we got gold in Fort Knox, right? They just tell us it's there. We have no idea. So I think to any logical mind, there's no better, safer, secure, more transparent and trusted way to have a reserve of a currency. But I'd like to know, like, right now, it seems to be, from the things that you've said and what I believe, that we are going through a sort of potentially a Ray Dalio would call like a change of the world order. We have 38s, and then tomorrow it'll be 39, and then in next month it'll be $40 trillion of debt, and that seems unsustainable. We have to refinance that debt, which means we need more money. The amount of taxes that we owe on the debt, is greater than the GDP that we produce. I know that like a lot of people have been saying that we're going to have a dollar collapse and a U.S. collapse for the past 20 years. They've been, like they always say, like, how much longer can we kick the can down the road, right? And then you had this interesting thing too. You told the story about the change from the British Empire to the American Empire, how we collected all this gold. And but I think at the time, still in the late 1800s, most countries were operating on a dual metal standard. Like they had silver and gold and thought they were both valuable, like the United States did and China did. And then at some point, United States decided to kind of go all in on gold, and China wanted to do the opposite, so they went all in on silver. There's a huge, massive silver deposit found in America, so that became massively inflated supply. Value of silver dropped, gold skyrocketed. So now the U.S. has the most valuable reserve in the world, which allows them to back the dollar with gold. And I kind of feel like that kind of scenario right now might be playing out. It's like that those who fail to see where the world is headed, and play their cards right of how they're going to have some sort of economic and financial power, or if you want to have your own currency be dominant, then it must be you must somehow be able to convince people that it should be. So yeah, I think that I'm curious about your thoughts on this too, but a smart play does seem like, because we believe, the only thing that gold has going for it right now is that more people in the world believe it to be they know it's a store of value because it's been like that for millennia. And so it has like all of this trust behind it, and Bitcoin's kind of new. But I think that eventually people will learn all the benefits of it and how it's probably actually better as a store of value than gold is. But yeah, I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on where we are right now, and the geopolitics, BRICS countries. Is BRICS creating a currency? Why is China stacking so much gold? Is the U.S. actually going to start actively acquiring gold, or is it, Bitcoin, or is that some sort of just show of confiscating Bitcoin? Like, what are your thoughts on how we move forward here?
Okay, let me try and break it down. So where we are is, I believe, a transition to a multipolar world. And a multipolar world means we have this power structure called America that controls the collective West, but America is not sovereign. It's controlled by the corporate interests of the proof of weapons network. So the West is subordinate to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the corporate interests and the nodes on the network. So what do they want is the question to answer what happens to the West. Then you have different countries that have recognized there is a change of power structure in the world. And so what is America? So America was originally, the British Empire handed over to the American Empire, and there was a controlled handover from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. The power bankers, they had 3 attempts at installing a central bank in America. That led to assassinations, deaths, but eventually they got the Federal Reserve in 1913. Then they created World War I. Then they had a gap in between. They created the Bank for International Settlements to redistribute the gold. And then they went into World War II. Yeah. And then after World War II, they created the Bretton Woods order. And so if you look at the dollar, you had the Great British Pound, which was strategically weakened in order to have gold outflows from the UK because the government was essentially bankrupted. And the empire got so complicated, they could no longer manage all the moving parts. And so America built a military, an industrial base. And because they had the manufacturing base, they ended up essentially, and they avoided the war, everyone just blew each other up. They provided all the weapons. And because they were manufacturing the weapons without having it fired on their ground, they managed to take over the British Empire. And that was managed through the transition from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then took the government from virtually zero debt to $38 trillion of debt in its 110 years. That was World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the fake war on terror, and the financialization and securitization through the benefit systems of every product. And so if you look at the debt, it really is just war, interest, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which is managed by the financial industrial complex and interest. And so the financial industrial complex receives all the interest on the debt. Now, yes, is it through financial products and owed to other people? Absolutely. It's a vast web. But essentially, the balance sheet of the Fed is a chunk of the debt, $10 trillion. They QT, QE, if they want to manipulate, change the rate, all that type of stuff, all the planning that happens there. But the banks are essentially the net beneficiary of all that interest via the largest lender to the UK government, which is Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands is who? Is your fund. And it's got its nodes. It's got Japan. It's got UK. It's got the subordinate power structures that print their currency, lend it to the US, buy those treasuries. As long as people are buying treasuries, the dollar continues.
Right.
And so they are looking to do more and more elaborate schemes. So let's look at the history of the dollar. The dollar was backed by gold, it had a relationship with the Great British Pound, and the dollar became an important country because it was backed by gold and its manufacturing base. Then more and more gold piled into Fort Knox. I think Fort Knox then allowed the Fed to collateralize it. And so the beneficiary of the gold was the private banks. Went into a Great Depression, did a pump and dump, confiscated all the Americans' gold, refilled the coffers by making gold ownership illegal, and then collateralized it and financialized it further through the Federal Reserve for their shareholders, the banks. The shareholders of the Federal Reserve receive a 6% dividend on all the assets on the balance sheet. So you can use these different mechanisms for manipulating the dollar. So you had a gold-backed currency. Then you had the Federal Reserve System, which levered up the gold reserves. Then you used the military-industrial complex. And the Treaty of Versailles was between World War I, World War II, where they renegotiated money by taking all of Germany's gold and putting it over. Then you move to the next stage, the Bretton Woods system, which is the dollar will be backed by gold and everyone convert your currencies into ours. And we'll do a Marshall Plan. We'll rebuild your country if you choose us over communism. They were funding both sides. So whichever side succeeded, they were managing and hedging their bets, which is a feature of the proof of weapons network. But the dollar became their tool because the Federal Reserve is owned by the banks get to create the dollar, and then they can perpetuate debt globally. And then they had the IMF and World Bank to export debt around the world. But then when they spent too much and the government was too indebted, and you had an inflationary cycle, you had stagflation, the Vietnamese War was a step too far. JFK decided to take on the military-industrial complex. The deep state decided to assassinate him. Then we had LBJ go into power. And you had the end of the Vietnamese War. And then we went into Nixon, 1971.
Yeah.
The French decided to pull up their ships and say, give me your gold, give me my gold. They said no, and then they defaulted and closed the gold standard. So then America got to keep the gold that was left. It was collateralized by the Fed. And then we entered into the full fiat standard in 1971, which was, as long as people will buy our treasuries, then the government can take on all the debt. We can use the stock market and the bond market to give people 0% interest loans. They can pump up the price of our stocks, and we'll rinse the consumer until they won't borrow anymore. We'll collateralize student loans, we'll collateralize auto loans, we'll collateralize mortgages, real estate, everything. In fact, you've reached the stage right now where you can buy some food from a supermarket and you have a pay per month and you can borrow against your food because people can't afford their food, right? Yeah. So eventually you reach the end of a debt cycle. So if you're BlackRock and you're the Proof of Weapons Network and you're State Street Vanguard and you're meeting in a World Economic Forum meeting, and you've got a Bilderberg meeting with the technical industrial complex, and you're putting out signals of where you're trying to move the capital flows, you create games to reset the world order. One of those, a massive tool, was, I'm not saying whether they did it on purpose. There's people that believe that COVID was created in a lab There was funding from Fauci into the Wuhan lab. I'm not even going down there. Just pretend it was a natural event. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because they weaponized it in order to consolidate much power into the proof of weapons network. You got everyone using their phones. You got everyone ordering from Amazon. You got people voluntarily sitting at home watching content. YouTube's traffic went through the roof. All of the tools of the proof of weapons network went through the roof. We got addicted to phones. We got addicted to devices. Everyone went on the control structure. You can't even be productive if you're not in this structure. You even started to ruin human psyche. We had massive pornography addiction, massive degeneracy. People didn't even know what their sexual orientation is anymore. I'm just talking about by controlling these operations, they basically rendered humans useless, and now the birth rates have gone absolutely down. If you look at the statistics right now, you've got record mental issues, record suicide rates, record financial exclusion, homelessness, drug addiction, the lowest birth rates. And so if you're looking at a spreadsheet and you're BlackRock and you're deciding how you want to manage your portfolio, you go, who's having the children today? Oh, Africa's still doing them, got them. And the Muslim nations are still having children. But everyone else isn't having children anymore. So where does the labor come? Okay, let's reset the world order and let's make sure that we allow Africa to grow. Let's allow the Middle Eastern energy that we want to utilize. Let's end the forever war over there. Let's vassalize Europe and destroy Europe. How do we do that? Well, we escalate a coup in 2014 with Ukraine. You push it forward with NATO expansion. You agitate Russia. And then you destroy Europe, because they need access to cheap energy. That energy is now sanctioned. And so therefore, Germany can no longer manufacture its manufacturing base. And therefore, Europe is big Germany. You do open borders policies. You change the demographics. You use media in order to make people think they're defending democracy. And then you have open borders, closed borders, and you fuel religious tensions by pushing out in the algorithms, the Muslims are taking over, the Jews rule the world, you're in danger, and you fuel up racial and religious tensions. And now Europe is fully vassalized. Blackstone comes in, buys all the water assets, buys all the land, buys all the real estate, buys all the property, buys all the politicians, pushes up the price of real estate, and you push up the price of assets. And now money printing is just used to push up the price of assets and enslave the people into debt. And then you get more and more wealth inequality, which creates more, radicalism. You end up either extreme on the right, trying to protect your assets and escape the country. That's UK. Or you end up extreme on the left, supporting in the US Mandani, looking for, you're looking for the government to protect you because you don't know what else to do. Right. Like you are out of the system. And that creates this environment of civil unrest. That's where we are today. Now, you then recognize that you try to infiltrate other countries. You're like, well, who can we get? So what was the source of the Russian conflict? So you had the fall of the Soviet Union in 91. Then you had, the end of the Cold War. Earlier was the end of the Cold War. Then you had the fall of the Soviet Union. And then they had the oligarchs that would financialize, securitize Russia. And then eventually Putin came in, arrested the people that would, and nationalized the oil. Great. He's the new Hitler. Let's make him the new Hitler. And if we can escalate war with Russia, we can destroy Europe and vassalize Europe into our control grids. And they can buy all of our oil. We can get them to print and have NATO budgets. We can just essentially use the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, in order to push up the price of our stocks. That's one game. But Russia is sovereign, and that's why he's public enemy number one. We also need to bring back the fake war on terror. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we'll go into Iraq, we'll radicalize a bunch of people, kill their families, we'll create a narrative of weapons of mass destruction, we'll take down the Twin Towers, we'll radicalize the Christians go into war with the Muslims, and then we'll also push and enslave, do essentially Israel, which is radicalize the Jews in order to think that they're in danger, radicalize the Muslims, and radicalize the Christians. So that they have successfully achieved, which was to destabilize the Middle East, so to make sure that they can never compete with the dollar. The problem is that they've now got sovereign wealth and they're buying the proof of weapons network. And so they get to kind of buy their freedom in a sense. So they're going through a decolonization process by partnering with the proof of weapons network. Dangerous game. They have to partner with the financial terrorists, but then they get to use their energy. And then there is a rising power that said, okay, how do we take on the dollar in the Middle East, the petrodollar? Well, China said, firstly, America became oil independent. That changed the world. That happened during the Biden administration. They invented fracking, and America is now an oil and gas exporter. That completely changes the game. That means that they're no longer buying, Saudi Arabian oil so that they can have oil reserves and they can prop up buy treasuries. That changes the game completely. And most people didn't even notice it. They didn't work through what are the implications. Well, China doesn't have energy. So it invests in renewable energy, every form of energy it possibly can. It genuinely is looking for all of those different types of energy. BlackRock co-invests and said, I tell you what, let's destroy Germany. Let's blow up Nord Stream pipeline. Let's agitate a war. Let's get them to invest all their money in renewable energy that we know that they need cheap gas in order to, they don't have their cheap gas. We get them to switch off their nuclear power plants. And we get them to invest trillions in renewable energy. Right. Let's radicalize people through climate change.
Right.
Let's do ESG scores. Let's give them a climate score. Let's give them literally a carbon credit score. And let's reset, we'll reset power structures and power dynamics. And let's co-invest. Who created the name BRICS? It was Goldman Sachs. So people think that there is US versus China. No. US is captured by the Proof of Weapons Network. The Proof of Weapons Network is a global institution that wants globalism. And they are partnering with China and these different regional power blocks in order to reset the world order and weaken the dollar in order to push capital flows into other regions. But before they do it, they want to own as many of the assets as they can. And so tariff policy was perfect for that. So tariff policy was perfect. It 100% helped BRICS that were aligning and various other. So anyway, the power structure is the Proof of Weapons Network controls the West. And then you have regional blocks that have regional sovereignty by actually partnering together. There's BRICS, there's ASEAN, there's the SCO, there's the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And all of these blocks have said, we can partner together to decolonize and de-dollarize. But who is the most important customer now? Who's buying all the oil? Who's buying all the gas? Who's providing the manufacturing base? It's China. And so China is the customer. And it is going around and saying, hey, we'll take all of these and we'll build you up. We just want you to be a sovereign country again. We want our control, of course. This is in our interest. But let's reverse the IMF. Let's reverse it. You buy using our currency. We'll create a structure where we can do barter. All of this is happening. If US sanctions you, you can circumvent sanctions. You can work with us. And we'll reinvest through the Belt and Road Initiative so that you don't need the IMF loan anymore. So IMF has gone down and down and down. Belt and Road Initiative has gone up and up and up. And what did they do? They formed an alliance called Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And then they partnered with the Gulf countries, added Iran, added UAE, added Egypt, and tried to add Saudi Arabia. But Saudi said, you're the most important customer. I've got the petrodollar. I don't like Biden, so we'll make his economy bad. We'll create an inflationary cycle. We'll wait for Trump. Trump will do the tariffs, and then we'll buy up the US, all of the US assets. We'll co-invest with the proof of weapons network. What happens during that time? Suddenly, BlackRock set up their office in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco got a board seat on BlackRock. And every single deal that the financial industrial complex, including the purchase of X, all of the artificial intelligence, was co-invested with the Gulf countries. And so the power structure that controls America is not America first. It is using America for its capital markets while it hedges, because the dollar is owned by the proof of weapons network. It is not for the American people. It is for the proof of weapons network and those that own the same assets. And so only those that own the stocks are the ones that can co-invest with this proof of weapons network. And that's the power structure. They're not trying to save America. They're saying, we're going to weaken the dollar to get capital outflows so that we can invest in as many of those countries outside America. We'll give them regional stability, but we use war in order to negotiate rebuild contracts.
Yeah.
And so once we get the rebuild contracts, we can start again. But eventually we lose the dollar, because we can only rinse this for as long as we can. For as long as people will buy bonds, and we can find a way of buying bonds, then what do we need? Well, this is going to lead to civil unrest. How are we going to control these people? Universal basic income, surveillance state, police state, stable coins, tokenization. We need to be ready. The biggest enemy are the American people and the European people. We need to make sure that we have all the control structure. And so they bought Trump, who was the biggest lobby contributors. Elon Musk, 150 million. Miriam Adelson, 100 million, which is Israel policy. And the Bank of New York Mellon family. Larry Ellison's, various other technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex. And they said, right, Trump, deregulate, stimulate the stock market, implement your tariff policy that you've always talked about, and then we can make all the small businesses in America that can't afford the import tax bankrupt. The stock market can do mergers and acquisitions. We'll buy up all the small businesses, because remember, America is an importer, not an exporter. So the importer generally pays the tariff. So all the money coming in is a tax on American small business. The large business say, I'll offset it with my China plant and my India plant and my global structure, so we don't pay it. And then when they're in distress, we'll acquire them. It's another COVID operation.
Yeah.
All of the export countries will buy them. And then all the countries, what are they going to do? They're going to say, I'm not trading with America. I'm going to sell my dollars. I'm going to sell my treasuries, convert them into dollars, and then redeploy them in other countries. And everyone is now negotiating with their relative blocks. And so America is being shrunk into a regional power, and it will be a regional power. It's going to control Mexico. It's going to control Canada. It's going to control Europe. It's going to continue to make up for lost profits by waging war in Latin America and various other regions. But it cannot exert influence outside of the region. Right. And now we split the world up into multipolarity, and now the dollar has competition. So we will use the dollar for as long as possible in order to get as much investment in the war zones, and then we'll negotiate rebuild contracts and regional stability, and then reinvest in a multipolar world. Now it won't be as profitable because we don't control China's currency. We don't control, those other aspects. So we need to vassalize as much as possible while we hedge, but we're going to shrink America into a regional power. Trump, you tell everyone how this is MAGA and it's going to make America great again. The rich are going to get richer. The poor are going to get poorer. People are going to get wrecked if they don't own the assets that the proof of weapons network owns. So then we go back into Bitcoin ETFs and gold pump.
Why don't you talk about, are there other assets that besides Bitcoin and gold that are going to keep you surviving in this future?
Okay, so look, you can either, here's the thing that I say to people, right? If you're co-invested with the proof of weapons network, if you own stocks and shares, and you allow BlackRock to manage your money, then you're probably going to be on the right side of this change. However, through deregulation, they're doing dumping of their private equity, various other things within that. The problem is that you're giving more power to BlackRock. And I think you should boycott. Because here's the real thing. Your vote doesn't matter, but your money does. So throughout, for example, the war, I call it a genocide in Israel, in Palestine. Throughout that time, people started boycotting Starbucks like crazy. Their share price went down 10%. Their executive was investing in illegal settlements. He had to leave. They do listen when it hits them. This is how you do control. Where you spend your money determines, whether they listen or not. And if you can affect their profits and share price, and you can make it more profitable to invest in a different way, they listen to that. And that does happen. And so the money is your vote, right? And so boycotting is highly effective. So how do you boycott this system? Well, you may not be able to change the system because the reality is Bitcoin's split in two and gold is as well. You got gold that you own and gold ETFs.
Mm-hmm.
And gold held in custody with in Switzerland, in Dubai, in these jurisdictions in Singapore, and some of them, So if you own it in custody, then it's not, if you don't have self custody of it, then you're at risk that it's not your weapon. It can be confiscated. It has been confiscated.
Yeah.
It's not quite a boycott. It's better than nothing. It's better than an ETF. But most people just buy ETFs. ETF is a mechanism for giving your money, allowing them to buy gold for you, and then them having the gold in their control. And if you do your shares with them, you buy ETFs, you even give your voting rights, and you give them more leverage to get a board seat in the company.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one thing you can do to protect yourself. And I judge nobody if they want to do that because this is complicated, right? Another thing you can do is you can say, well, resetting the world order, what is Bitcoin and gold now? It's a liquidity sponge. So if you're managing a massive change in the world, like I believe BlackRock and various power structures are, you create liquidity sponges for people that want to manage the transition. That's what the central banks are doing with gold right now. Central banks are trying to accumulate as much gold as possible. They're not buying gold, they're selling dollars, right? So they're hedging away from the dollar. Now, that's what all central banks are doing right now. Now, what did BlackRock do? Well, BlackRock engineered a game to take over as much of the crypto market as it could. Used the Biden administration to do that. Then set up a game where they could get the ETF approved and use the Trump administration in order to deregulate and get everyone, all of their companies, all of the banks and financial institutions and anyone into Bitcoin. And so it becomes a alternative liquidity sponge, but they say you have to do it via the Bitcoin ETF. We want you to own Bitcoin, but we want to custody it with Coinbase, and we'll make sure that Coinbase is on the proof of weapons network. We'll take them public. Anyone that goes public will also create other vehicles like Strategy. We'll recruit Michael Saylor, get as much Bitcoin as possible. You advocate for Bitcoin, put it in a public company. We'll increase our shareholding. Once it hits S&P 500, we'll get passive investment. We'll also create an ETF for blockchain. We'll own the mining companies. Let's get as many miners to set up in Texas. We'll vassalize them, securitize them, get as much control as we can over the mining network. and basically use all the tools that they could. Then Trump will deregulate. Then they can put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. The banks can put it on their balance sheet. Then people can borrow against their Bitcoin. We use some of our primary dealer brokers in different nodes like Cantor Fitzgerald. They can get as many people to borrow against their Bitcoin. We can then decide when we want to elaborately get margin calls. We can manipulate markets up and down. We can liquidate. We can create leverage. We can create futures. We can create options. So they're constructing all the financial weapons of mass destruction to try and persuade you to give your Bitcoin to them.
Right.
And then they're going to try and get you to borrow against it. And then they're going to try and get you to invest in public companies rather than Bitcoin. And now they've got 2 million
then
Bitcoin.
They're going to liquidate you and take your Bitcoin. And
exactly. Anyone that was around in 2021, you know what that looks like on the cowboy level. Now the big boys.
Man. I lost a lot of Bitcoin and COVID.
Yeah. So they created a Bitcoin financial industrial complex. The crypto lobbyists pushed the world to stable coins. The banks drafted Genius Act and made it in favor for them, but also have all these stablecoin issuers so they could build the technical industrial complex. You get rogue stablecoins like Tether that now have to set up in the US. And now they have a board which recruited the White House team. And then you get them to buy the ballroom. So they're investing in the White House ballroom right now. And so you create a crypto lobby, this rise of this new lobby, which is turning a Bitcoin strategy that could have saved the dollar into weaponizing the dollar for corporate interest again. And so you have this new rise of this new corporate, which is a stablecoin issuer. Trump's family issue one, Steve Witkoff's family start investing in the industry, and all these different things. I could go deep into it. But what do they want? So then I get to, how do you actually boycott the network and protect yourself at the same time? Well, the boycott of the dollar is created by the banks are the shareholders of the Fed. And so if you want to boycott the proof of weapons network, you buy Bitcoin or you buy gold. Now, Bitcoin in self-custody is where you actually boycott. If you buy an ETF, you're stuck in, they'll get you to borrow against it, and then you'll mine some fiat currency and they'll margin call your Bitcoin when they can. And so you give them power by doing that. And then by borrowing against your Bitcoin, you have mined some fiat currency and you're empowering the banks and the proof of weapons network. And so they create very elaborate tax incentives to do it, inheritance incentives to do it. And once you buy a Bitcoin ETF, you ain't selling that ETF, taking a tax hit, figuring out how to get it into dollars, taking those dollars, buying Bitcoin and putting it in self-custody. Let's face it, no one's doing that, right? So then you also create these Bitcoin treasury companies. You go back to all the original Bitcoiners and say, hey, I've managed to lobby a really nice tax structure. Give me a Bitcoin and put it in this company. And then we'll raise you a couple of $1 billion and you can buy more Bitcoin. You can lever it right up. And we'll end up buying those companies in Chapter 11 once we push it to a discount to the Bitcoin net asset value. And so they've got all these elaborate schemes to make sure that you don't own your Bitcoin in self-custody. And they're doing very well. As a financial industrial complex, they've now got approximately 2 million Bitcoin under Wall Street financial weapons of mass destruction.
And that happened in such a short amount of time. It's crazy. Like, what, 2 years, really? That all happened?
Yeah, and remember, sorry, I could go conspiratorial, but I was a creditor in the Celsius bankruptcy. I know every detail because I read 4,000 pages of documents. Every document that went through that court. I know the deep state connections of every single hack and every single thing, and where the families, where the people that were behind that Ponzi scheme are now, and who they're working with. And I'll give you a clue. They've got AI startups with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel, and some of the hacks were done by those that owned companies like Bank or Dow that were actually shareholders, were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. Mossad goes back through to CIA, deep state. Sam Bankman-Fried, he was the only one that got a meeting. Who took out the crypto-friendly banks? Signature, Silvergate. They were the ones that were providing the blockchain dollar structure for Alameda Capital and FTX. Who in that network? Who is it? So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying that there's an elaborate conspiracy theory, but there was an operation, and it was called Operation Choke Point 2.0. And I believe that members of the Federal Reserve and that the highest power of structure were involved in that elaborate pump and dump scheme, because the end result was financial capture of the Bitcoin industry. That was the end result. Now, you have Bitcoin in self-custody and you have Bitcoin in Wall Street. That's the new game.
I think
empower the proof of weapons network by giving them your Bitcoin, or you continue to boycott the system and own it in self-custody. I'm not sure whether we're going to win, because people are too gullible and convenient, and the tax incentives are just far too tempting. Right. And people are broke, so they're borrowing against their Bitcoin in order to mine some fiat currency. And Michael Saylor told them all to do it. And the logic of why to do it makes sense.
Yeah,
but
it does make sense.
It does make sense. But there's not so many principled people. So all these old school Bitcoiners are setting up Bitcoin treasury companies and converting 30,000 Bitcoin into, and then levering it up and just doing it. And they're creating not quite the crypto industrial complex that led to the fraud and Ponzi's and all the stuff of Celsius and BlockFi and Voyager and FTX. But there's definitely a regulated version that's emerging. And it's just as Ponzi, because remember, the banks, they own the Fed. They own the Treasury. They own the lobby. They can privatize the gains and socialize the losses. And so you are their exit liquidity. They want your Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And they will make sure, if you're not managing this well, that they get your Bitcoin by hook or by crook. And they want more Bitcoin. And it is a liquidity sponge while they manage this transition. And then eventually they'll look to price these products in different currencies. So they're doing that now. They're launching Australian ETFs, European ETFs, Hong Kong ETFs. And they're doing that with all of their products, all of their ETFs, and they're hedging their bets. They will rinse the dollar until no one will buy those treasuries, and then they'll sell them to stable coins, and they'll dump them all on the American people until the American people are on a universal basic income. And guess how they'll get their first check? The stable coin.
Yeah, of course. And they only get that UBI if they download the nice app that's going to be presented to you in a really lovely way of like, hey, now no longer will you have to manually do your taxes. It's all done automatically for you. Like now you can travel with this thing. You can do all this and that. You can do all your paying. Everything's consolidated, and you get that's where you get your UBI. It does sound really nice, but ultimately it's for control. One thing that you said a few minutes ago that was really interesting to me. You get a lot of people who say something like, if we consolidate, if people keep buying the ETFs and BlackRock controls majority of the supply, and like the financial industrial complex, they're gonna eventually be able to control Bitcoin, right? And I never understood that argument, because like who needs to make the voting decisions to actually structurally change? It's not just owning Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't proof of stake; it's proof of work, right? So the miners and validators need to be the ones to make decisions and upgrade the network. But what you said and what you see right now from like the little Trumps is like American Bitcoin, right, just doing the mining. But that makes a lot of sense that that there's going to be a lot more interest, and why the hash rate keeps going up from new players, probably this entire financial industrial complex you talked about. And I don't, I think for them, whether they do intend to change some core fundamental structure of Bitcoin or not, I think it's nice for them to know that they can if they want to. And I think that it also helps with just being able to also control, they also know the future of Bitcoin, right? They also know that the future of Bitcoin in the long run will eventually be much more valuable than it is today. And so you might as well mine it. You might as well control it. And like, I also found it very fascinating what you said about, how they're going to financially engineer this whole thing because they will control the supply, because they will control the exchanges, they will control Brian Armstrong and CZ and everything else, and will have all the liquidity. Like they will get you to borrow against it, collateralize it, dump it, take your Bitcoin, pump it right back up. Like that's what happened to me on Nexo. I like by a few cents, right? I got like auto liquidated on that COVID dump, and I think if you actually looked at it, but anyway, like that will be events that happen to where eventually there's more and more centralization of Bitcoin amongst the elite and the this thing. Like that's all quite interesting.
Yeah. So here's the irony, right? The irony is that Trump's vision. I want all Bitcoin. I know he doesn't understand Bitcoin. He's reading a script. He's been told that he needs to support this. He's got crypto lobby. He's got his family. They're getting rich from it. They know what, Trump knows where the financial industrial complex are taking the world. Trump's investing all his money in the Gulf. He's going to set up he's going to get a Trump Tower in Saudi and UAE, and he's trying to buy Gaza. He's facilitating, the purchase of all American assets by the Gulf countries. One of his largest sources of loans is ICBC, the largest bank in China. So I'm saying all I do is, again, people might think I got Trump derangement syndrome. If Biden was in charge, I'd do the exact same thing of everything that's happening with Biden, right?
Yeah.
This is a power structure that no one is subordinate to. Trump has narrative that makes people think he's making America great again. He is shrinking America through manufacturing chaos into the vision that the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network paid him to do, which is regional power. America, get in your box, and we're going to have capital flows into the Gulf countries, and they're partnered with BRICS, and there's different power plays that are happening, along that way. And China's the manufacturing base. We need you to get as independent as we can, but in manufacturing this, so you've got America. The worst thing you could do for Bitcoin is give more power to America, because America is the financial industrial complex. And so they're not building Bitcoin strategic reserves. They're confiscating Bitcoin from criminal activities. They're issuing stable coins, and they're building the surveillance state, and they're creating pro-bank regulations for crypto and this stable coin standard.
Yeah.
They're allowing you to buy, own some Bitcoin. But what else was in the Genius Act? It was they're arresting the Samurai Wallet team, self-custody. The DOJ is coming after them at all full force. They're saying that in the Genius Act and the Clarity Act, they don't want you to use individual wallet addresses on your hardware wallet so you can obfuscate your transactions. And they're saying don't use coin joins. So they're disincentivizing self-custody. They're giving you narrative with anti-CBDC. We're not like Europe, them control people. But they're giving all the power to the proof of weapons network. Okay, so America is then using the weapons to get as much of the mining industry. Now, what do we know about Bitcoin? We know that Bitcoin is anti-fragile, right? We know we've got all of our history. Bitcoin survives, by the way. But the psyop is that the more Bitcoin held within the financial industrial complex structure, by turning Coinbase into a public company, by creating Bitcoin treasury companies, by having Michael Saylor that's using all the debt capital markets and the equity capital markets, by having Cantor Fitzgerald borrow against your Bitcoin, by having World Liberty Financial stable coins, by having all of the constructs that everybody is buying into, by creating as many Bitcoin mining companies, by even trying to pay the developers to push the direction that we want the code to go,
right?
Which is why we need competing. And fortunately, Bitcoin is proof of work. So we know you've got nodes So people need to run their own nodes if we want to maintain power. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but enough of us need to do it. We need to have competing implementations of Bitcoin Core. We need to have strategies in case they get corrupted. We need to make sure that the mining is geographically diversified outside of America, which is why, you had China ban. Suddenly the industry grew in Texas. Suddenly you had all the companies go in public.
Yeah.
This is how much control can we gain. And then you need to not borrow against it. You need to hold it in self-custody. So here's the thing. America is gaining more and more power. The more power America gains over Bitcoin in centralized Wall Street wrappers, the more power you're giving to the financial industrial complex. What can they do with that power? Well, the more power you give them, the more ability they have to short-term manipulate the price of Bitcoin to try and get your Bitcoin. The more power you give them to try and steal your Bitcoin through margin calls in legal ways, and the more power they get in order to build all of the derivatives tools. What can't they control? As long as there is node operators, as long as there is competing miners globally, as long as there is competing development teams, this is still the most decentralized thing that exists in the world, and we need to maintain that. But you need to decide, am I going to empower the proof of weapons network or am I going to boycott the proof of weapons network? So you have those two-tiered power structures. The beauty is that if you boycott it, it does come with a reward. You get to own your own money. You get to spend your own money, and you get the benefit of number goes up technology from the fixed supply. But the more power you give them, the more they will short-term manipulate it. And here's the thing. If you're borrowing against your Bitcoin and you're levered up to the tilt and you're trading shit coins, you're borrowing against it, you're wrapping it in Ethereum, you're doing DeFi contracts, you're buying houses. And if you are levered up too much, they can outweigh you. It's a time game. You want to own your Bitcoin because they can't manipulate the price long-term, just like they can't manipulate the price of gold long-term. And so they will use their patience and your impatience because you're levered. Why do they want you buying futures, options, borrowing against it? Because what it does is it adds time to your money. Where if you are levered, you can firstly get overexposed.
Yeah.
And you have to trade to meet a certain time frame before that options contract expires, before that perpetual futures. The more you add time to your money through their products and you lever, the more likely you are to lose your Bitcoin and then end up with it. And they will patiently wait because they can outweigh you. They can definitely outweigh you. So the more leverage you use, the more custody you use, the more wrappers you use, the more things that aren't Bitcoin that look like Bitcoin that you invest in, the more you're empowering an enemy, and they will outweigh you. So that's how we win. And those with Bitcoin in self-custody that are running nodes, they're the resistance.
Yeah.
And you need to become a part of the resistance because there's major benefits. If they try and confiscate those Bitcoin in self-custody, you can take your Bitcoin with you and go wherever you need to go. That comes with you, self-custody.
Yeah.
Try and get your ETF over the border when they're trying to confiscate. Ain't going to happen. And try and spend your Bitcoin ETF.
Right.
Ain't going to happen.
Nope.
Try and end up with what originally was, we got investors. We started this. We're talking about Bank to the Future investors. We had a moment when we were mining Bitcoin and we created a Bitcoin bond and we were paying our investors like 1 Bitcoin every day at one stage. They ended up with like a 10,000 investment that was worth, multi-millions for those that kept it over the years. When something that was worth a small amount becomes worth a lot, you try and withdraw it. You see how long it takes. You try and spend it. You see how long it takes. You got to provide all your source of funds, all the surveillance documents, all of the proof that how you made it. You can't put it through a coin join. It can't go to the amount of surveillance in these centralized companies, and they have to by law adhere, or they end up in prison. This is one of the reasons why, we were kind of just humbled by our early investors, but we didn't take Silicon Valley money, didn't go public, and recognize that we just wanted to become a treasury company. Is because we see what happens when you grow. You become a tool for the proof of weapons network. And we wanted to remain independent. So that's the benefit of self-custody.
100%. Simon, I know that you got to go soon, but there's so much more that I wanted to talk about, like really about the future moving forward. I wanted to talk about the AI situation, artificial superintelligence. It appears to be publicly through the media a U.S. versus China super race, kind of like the new Cold War. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. I want to hear about your thoughts on the potential corruption of Bitcoin if it gets out of hand versus like, do you believe in alternatives like Zcash or Monero? The competing, like what's happening right now in the competition of the BTC core and the suggested improvements. I want to hear your thoughts on the timeline for AI superintelligence to where it starts to oversee, or at least be a lot smarter than anyone on the planet, and which directions that could go and how we might be able to protect ourselves from that. Or on the opposite end, like what does a post-scarcity world look like, and how does economics look in a world like that? And I also want to know like what you're doing. Like you're super aware of all this stuff going on. So I'd also like to find out like what is your 5, 10, 15 year kind of strategy to survive and be happy, and no matter kind of the best you can, kind of no matter what happens with all these looming current power shifts and AI and stuff like that. So I'd love to have you on for a follow-up fairly soon if you're open to it. Today was an amazing, just detailed, amazing, super interesting history lesson about the power mechanics and how the world truly operates. And even someone for me who thought I had a pretty good idea learned tons today and challenged a lot of my thoughts as well. So I really appreciate that. And would love to see you on again soon.
Okay, thanks, Carl. I do like to leave people with, because sometimes it can be a bit of a red pill. So I'd like to just at least leave with some empowering thoughts of what you can do.
Please. Please.
And then I will certainly come back. And if people enjoy it, we'll do a part 2. They can let us know in the comments. All of those are very interesting topics. I will give you the same thing that I said 14 years ago. I've been saying the same thing for 14 years. And I did it. And everybody I know that has done it has survived all of these shifts. And these are simple things that everyone can do. Ignore price of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Own more Bitcoin this month than last month.
Mm-hmm.
Do that for 4 years. And then come back in 4 years and contact Kyle and myself on X or something and tell us how you did.
Yeah.
Every single person that I know that bought more Bitcoin, that owned more Bitcoin this month than last month, outperformed the whole proof of weapons network, Larry Fink, every fund manager, real estate, gold, crypto, all of it, the trading crypto, everything. And that's the interesting thing. You don't need to know any of this stuff, but if you do one thing, spend less than you earn and save the difference in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than the next month. And as your wealth grows, do it for a minimum of 4 years. That's the 4-year challenge. Every month for 4 years.
Yeah.
You won't go back. It will be a lifetime once you've done that, because I've said this ever since Bitcoin was $3. And I'd say this at $110,000 today. Same thing. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month. Ideally, if you're going to borrow against it, I'm not going to judge you. If you're going to borrow against it because you have to manage your finances, make sure that you're only doing that with a percentage of the Bitcoin you're willing to lose. Even if you don't lose it, just make sure you're only levering. Don't lever 100% of your Bitcoin. Only borrow against a fraction of your Bitcoin if you are going to do it, because you need to manage your flows. Ideally, don't do it at all. Ideally, and definitely own it in self-custody. Eventually you could end up running a node. And here's what I'd say: it's a journey. You don't need to get all this shit right away. It's a journey. It's overwhelming. It's information overload. It's crazy. But a couple of resources. Firstly, every single week I'll go live. I cover This Week in Bitcoin, macro, geopolitics. You can follow me on YouTube, Simon Dixon, put my name in.
I'll put the link below.
Yeah, excellent. I publish all resources on blog. Even when I do a 2-hour thing like this, I'll turn it into a 15-minute AI summary because people are time poor, these types of things. Kyle's doing lots of stuff. Follow Kyle. I give updates in real time on X, and so just join a community. Be willing to be overwhelmed, but just do one thing up front. Commit to own. If you're on 0 Bitcoin, just buy it regardless of the price today. Own more next month. Learn how to take it off an exchange and put it in self-custody. Commit to that first step and do it every month for 4 years. And just do that one thing and then join the journey, and we'll take the whole journey together.
It's such good advice, and it keeps things so simple. When you're like, as they call it in crypto, the crypto bubble, like when you're in the trenches or you're trying to find something that's going to outperform Bitcoin, it's always super risky. Or you're trying to leverage and make more money because you think that you're going to be able to succeed in that leverage. In 2015, I've been telling my parents about Bitcoin since I think 2013, trying to convince them to come in. But eventually, my mom realized that she should, and she had her retirement account that she could in a Roth IRA, something she rolled over through Fidelity into buying Bitcoin and then getting those Bitcoin self-custodying on a Trezor, and that's all she's done. And then she DCAs every week what she can afford to DCA in. So that's been her strategy. She doesn't do anything complicated. She just holds it there, and she's done extremely well. And then you take that versus me, who has at least I had a lot of Bitcoin in early in 2012. And so I guess it sucks that I've lost quite a bit learning these lessons along the way, thinking I could, do this or that or whatever. But I'm pretty sure that she's definitely outperformed me since 2015 just by doing that strategy. And so because it's really hard to really win and know when to take profits and know how to play the markets unless you master it. So I think it's phenomenal advice. That's really what people should be doing. So thanks for sharing that. And
I'll leave you with, you talked about your parents. So my father and mother are no longer with us. I lost both of them like 22 and 23.
Wow.
My mother, she invested in the Bitcoin bond and passed away incredibly wealthy because of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
My father just couldn't get his head around anything digital. Yeah. Wealth wasn't real unless it was physical. Once he saw a big mansion house, then wealth was real. But he couldn't get his head. Once he had cash in his hand, and he believed it, and he was just from that generation. And so sometimes the people that you love aren't going to get it and aren't going to do it. So I just did it for him. And I think that's the greatest gift you could give somebody, because many people around you aren't going to get it and aren't going to be prepared. We're moving to a world of Bitcoin, AI, central bank digital currencies, mass surveillance, stable coins. Like, this is complicated stuff. People ain't going to manage this stuff well. But you can do it. And the most amazing thing that ever happened to me, my father lost all of his money in the dot-com boom and bust. And the only reason I got into finance and went into investment banking and left and got into monetary reform and then tried to create a bank and then ended up with Bitcoin, because my father asked me one question after the dot-com boom and bust. He said, son, I worked my whole life. I went from complete poverty during World War II to making $1 million, my whole lifetime work. And I lost it all. Where's it gone? And he had no idea where it went. And it was that one question that inspired me to learn everything about this financial system possible. And, the day that I was able to pay off his mortgage, thanks to Bitcoin, I was able to give him in his final years everything he could want, and he didn't want much to force it upon him. But his final years, as he started to go into dementia and various other things, he was completely financially taken care of. And that was because he asked one question, and that led me up to Bitcoin. And I ended up doing the same thing I'm telling you to do. So even if your family won't listen and your friends won't listen, just empower yourself and you commit to doing it. Because some people ain't going to do it. But the world is going to rapidly change. And there's only going to be a few people that are going to, get through and navigate these challenges successfully. And most people just think still Bitcoin's a Ponzi scheme and it's going to be all this crazy stuff. So you do it, and do it for the people that you care about, and do it for yourself. And that's my final message.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon. Hopefully see you back very, very soon. We'll put all your links in the description below. And thank you.
Thanks, Carl.